ever completely blank on what someone said just seconds ago,
Oh, yeah.
or walked right past a friend, totally missing them, even though they were in plain sight.
Happens to the best of us.
Our brains are filtering information constantly, and sometimes the really interesting stuff, it just slips through the cracks.
It's true.
That's what today's deep dive is all about. We're taking excerpts from the newly revised and expanded edition of How to Tell What People Are Thinking by Peter Collett
Oh, cool.
to uncover the secret language of tells.
It's fascinating how often we think of tells as something only poker players need to worry about, but it's so much more than that. Every day, we're sending and receiving nonverbal signals, revealing bits of ourselves without even realizing it.
Like a secret language, everyone speaks but few people consciously understand. And this book digs into a surprising range of situations, from power dynamics and deception to the subtle cues of attraction, and even the unexpected messages hidden in something like nervous laughter.
What's important to remember is that tells aren't just interesting quirks. They can have a very real impact. Learning to read them can give you an edge in negotiations, make you a more effective communicator, even help you spot if someone's being dishonest.
Okay, so let's decode this language. First things first, what exactly are tells, and how do they differ from just, someone having a nervous habit?
Think of tells as unintentional glimpses behind the curtain of our carefully constructed facades. They're those moments when our body language betrays our true emotions, even if we're trying hard to keep them hidden.
So if someone's sweating profusely during a big presentation, it's probably not just the room temperature, right? It's a tell that gives away their internal state.
Exactly. Or let's say you're in a meeting and someone's trying to project confidence, but their voice keeps cracking.
Oh, yeah.
That's their body betraying their true feelings of uncertainty.
And what about those super fast facial expressions they call microtells? The book mentioned those are almost impossible to catch.
You're right, they are incredibly fleeting, but they offer a fascinating window into someone's genuine emotions. Imagine someone offering a polite smile while receiving criticism, but for a split second, a flash of anger crosses their face. That's a microtell.
No wonder we sometimes walk away from a conversation feeling like something was off but can't quite put our finger on it. These cues are flying by faster than our conscious minds can process.
Exactly. And to make it even trickier, we have to learn to distinguish these genuine tells from what the book calls false tells, or actions that might seem revealing but are actually just habits.
Okay, so what makes a tell false? How can we tell the difference?
It's all about context. Let's say someone constantly clicks their pen during a meeting. That might seem like a tell for nervousness, but if they do it all the time, it's more likely a habit unrelated to the current situation.
I see.
Genuine tells are more spontaneous and directly connected to the emotions someone's trying to conceal in that moment.
So to become a better tell detective, we need to pay attention to the unintentional in-the-moment reactions, not just someone's everyday quirks. But what's the real-world application here? Why should we care about decoding these subtle signals?
It's not just about curiosity, though that's a big part of it for me. Understanding tells can be incredibly useful in all sorts of situations. It can help you gauge the truthfulness of what someone's saying, navigate tricky social dynamics, even give you an advantage in a negotiation.
Okay, so let's dive into some specific scenarios. The book spends a good amount of time on dominance, tells those nonverbal cues we use to size each other up. Where do we even begin with that?
It often starts with the most basic, even primal cues. You might be surprised to learn that historically, most U.S. presidents have been taller than the national average.
That's interesting. Now that you mention it, it's hard to picture a U.S. president who wasn't, well, tall. But why is that? What makes height such a powerful signal of dominance?
It likely goes back to our evolutionary roots. Height can be associated with physical strength and the ability to protect or lead. Even if we don't consciously realize it, those associations can influence how we perceive and respond to someone.
So it's not just about actual height, but the subconscious messages we've learned to associate with it. And speaking of subconscious messages, the book had some colorful examples of how men, in particular, assert dominance.
Yes, the author discusses how Italian men often adjust their crotches as a dominance display. He even gave it a name, the scrotch.
Right, the scrotch. Not exactly something you'd see in a boardroom, I hope. But the point is, it's about projecting an image, taking up space, even if it's a bit much.
Precisely, and it's not limited to men. Think about a classic power, pose arms akimbo, elbows out, taking up space. We see this across cultures and throughout history. from portraits of Henry VIII to, well, maybe your boss in that next meeting.
It's like claiming your territory, showing you're not afraid to be seen, right? But what about the opposite end of the spectrum? How do deception tells come into play?
Deception is fascinating because it's essentially a constant game of concealment. We're trying to control what we reveal, but our bodies often betray us no matter how hard we try to maintain that poker face. Psychologist Paul Ekman has dedicated his career to studying deception, and his research on microexpressions really highlights this.
I've heard of microexpressions, but I've never fully understood how they work. Can you explain it?
Essentially, they're fleeting facial expressions that reveal our true emotions for a fraction of a second, even when we're trying to mask them. They're so fast that they often go unnoticed by the untrained eye, but they can be incredibly revealing if you know what to look for.
So if someone says they're not upset, but you catch a quick flash of anger on their face, that's a microexpression.
Exactly. They might be trying to hide their anger, but their face betrays their true feelings for a fleeting moment. Ekman's research found that these microexpressions are incredibly difficult to control because they're controlled by a different part of the brain than our voluntary facial movements.
So while someone might be able to control their words and their general demeanor, these tiny involuntary facial movements can give them away.
It's a fascinating example of how our bodies often tell a different story than our words. And it's not just about facial expressions either. The book also mentions some compelling examples from the world of sports. Think about a rugby player executing a dummy pass. They're looking one way, pretending to pass the ball, but then whoosh, they keep running. It's all about misdirection.
And their opponent falls for it because our brains are wired to interpret those cues in a certain way.
Exactly. And it highlights how these tells aren't just relevant in high-stakes games. They're everywhere in our everyday interactions, especially when it comes to love and relationships.
Okay, you've got my attention. Love, lies, and laughter. We've got to unpack that one. Love, lies, and laughter.
Yeah.
It does have a certain ring to it. So how do tells play into something as complex as, say, attraction?
Well, even in those early stages of attraction, before a word is spoken, we're sending subtle signals. The book talks about how women often use what's called the strobe glance.
I've definitely heard of that one. It's that look across a crowded room, making eye contact, looking away, and then back again, right?
Exactly. It's a way of signaling interest without being overly forward. And it turns out men have their own unconscious tells when they're attracted to someone.
Do tell.
The research suggests that men tend to lower their voices when they're speaking to a woman they find attractive.
Interesting. So it's not just something they do in romantic comedies. There's actually some science behind it.
It seems so. The book explained it has to do with testosterone levels, although it doesn't necessarily correlate with size.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's good to know. But it makes you wonder how much of this we pick up on without even realizing it. And it's not just about what we do, but what we don't do, right?
The book also talked about Princess Diana and the surprising power of touch.
That was a fascinating section. Diana famously broke royal protocol by physically connecting with people, hugging them, offering comfort. It contrasted sharply with the royal family's more reserved, non-contact culture, right? She had a reputation for meeting people where they were, both literally and figuratively.
And that physical touch, that willingness to connect on a human level, spoke volumes. It challenged those unspoken rules about distance and a formality, especially for someone in her position.
Which just goes to show how much meaning we attach to these seemingly small gestures. But then there's the flip side of that, laughter. We usually associate it with joy or humor, but the book argues it can be a tell for something far more unsettling.
Absolutely. Nervous laughter is a fascinating phenomenon. It often crops up in situations where we're feeling uncomfortable or trying to deflect from intense emotions. The book even mentions the Milgram experiment as an example.
Wait, you mean the experiment where participants were told to deliver electric shocks to another person? People were laughing during that.
Believe it or not, yes. Some participants exhibited nervous laughter even as they were administering what they believed to be painful shocks.
That's chilling. I mean, I understand nervous laughter in awkward situations, but that takes it to a whole other level.
Yeah. Right, and it highlights how laughter isn't always a sign of amusement. In this case, it was likely a coping mechanism, a way to alleviate the tension and moral discomfort they were experiencing.
So laughter can be a shield, a way to distance ourselves from difficult emotions. Makes you really stop and think about how many other seemingly innocent actions might have hidden meanings. But all this talk of tells makes me wonder, are we just naturally bad at reading these signs? Or is there something more to it?
Well, we've already touched on how our brains filter out a lot of information, like with the change blindness you mentioned earlier. But there's also a fascinating concept called tell blindness.
Tell blindness, what's that?
It essentially means we're often blind to the tells right in front of us because we're so focused on something else. The book describes an experiment where two workmen carrying a door briefly switch places with a researcher while asking someone for directions.
Okay, I'm picturing this workman, a door, asking for directions. What's the catch?
The catch is that over half the participants didn't even notice the person they were talking to had changed. They were so focused on the task at hand giving directions that they completely missed the switch.
Wow. It really shows you how selective our attention can be. We tune out what we think is irrelevant, even when it's right in front of our faces.
And that's the challenge with becoming a tell detective, as you put it. It requires us to retrain our brains to pay attention to the details, the subtle cues we usually dismiss as insignificant.
So it's about becoming a more mindful observer. But how do we actually do that? Is there a secret formula for becoming a human lie detector?
There's no magic formula, unfortunately. It's more about shifting your mindset and practicing the art of observation. Think of it like this. You wouldn't expect to become a chess master overnight, right? It takes time, practice, and a willingness to learn from your mistakes. The same goes for reading tells.
So it's less about memorizing a list of tells and more about developing a deeper understanding of human behavior.
Exactly, and it starts with being more present in our interactions, paying attention to those subtle cues, the tone of voice, the fleeting expressions, the way someone positions their body, and then trying to connect those cues to the bigger picture.
It's like putting together a puzzle, looking for those subtle clues that help us make sense of the bigger picture. But as you said, it takes practice and a willingness to pay attention. This has been a fascinating deep dive. Any final thoughts for our listeners before we wrap things up?
If there's one thing I hope listeners take away from this, it's that we're all part of this intricate dance of nonverbal communication. Every day, we're sending and receiving signals, whether we realize it or not. So the next time you're interacting with someone, take a moment to really observe their body language and your own. You might be surprised by what you discover.
That's a great note to end on. It's a reminder that there's always more to learn about ourselves and the world around us. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating language of tells.
It's